The court in Paris had seen many young brides before women married off to cement alliances, paraded in silken jewels, then tucked neatly away in their husband's shadow. Isabella, the former Queen of England, could have been the same, a glittering ornament to be admired but never truly heard. Yet from the moment she crossed the threshold into Charles, Duke of Orleans' household, something shifted. The air here was warmer, less suffocating than the stone corridors of Westminster. Charles was no towering warrior king, but his presence carried a gentler strength. He really listened when Isabella spoke, even on matters of governance. It was an unexpected equality, the kind that drew curious whispers among courtiers used to seeing women excluded from real decision-making. They dined together, not as distant partners, but as companions. Over the clink of goblets and the rustle of fine linen, Charles would share news from the estates, poems he had composed, or the subtle intrigues brewing among France's nobles. Isabella, for her part, offered observations shaped by her years in the English court, where flattery was a currency and hesitation a liability. It was not love in the way poets sang of, at least. Not yet, but there was a sense of mutual respect, a recognition that each could strengthen the other. For Isabella, who had once been a political prize handed to a foreign king, the change was intoxicating. Still, shadows lingered. Beyond the palace walls, France was fractured. The mad fits of King Charles VI had left the throne vulnerable, and two great factions, one led by Louis of Orleans, Charles's father, the other by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, were locked in a struggle for dominance. At court, smiles were masks, and every banquet was a theater of alliances and betrayals. Isabella learned quickly that survival here meant not only grace, but vigilance. Yet in those early months, she allowed herself a fragile optimism. She was still young, barely past childhood, but she was beginning to see a path forward, not merely as a duchess by marriage, but as a woman who might wield influence in her own right. And though she could not know it yet, the quiet trust between her and Charles would soon be tested by storms neither of them could avoid. The winter that followed brought both joy and dread to Isabella's life. In the dimly lit chamber, its walls hung with rich Arras tapestries to keep the cold at bay, she gave birth to a daughter. The child's first cry pierced the air like a fragile trumpet, a sound that made Charles's eyes soften and Isabella's heart swell with fierce protectiveness. But even as the midwives bustled and the nurses cooed, Isabella knew the truth. A daughter, in this brutal chess game of kingdoms, was both blessing and liability. Girls could be married off to forge alliances, but they rarely secured power for their mothers. In the eyes of the realm, Isabella's worth was not yet proven. She needed to bear a son, a living, breathing heir who could tie the bloodlines of England and France into a knot too strong for enemies to pull apart. The memory of her first child still haunted her. Years earlier, when she was Queen of England, she had lost an infant son. His tiny body, swaddled in white, had been taken from her before she could even memorize his face. That grief had carved something permanent into her, something that no crown, no title, could erase. Now, holding her newborn daughter, Isabella felt both an ache and a vow. She would protect this child from the serpentine politics that had devoured so many innocents before. But she also understood that in the ruthless arithmetic of dynastic power, she could not stop here. Charles sensed it too, though he doted on their little girl. There was a quiet urgency in the way he spoke of next time, of when the sun comes. He did not voice disappointment aloud. It would have been unthinkably cruel, but in the flicker of his gaze, Isabella saw the truth. Outside their chambers, the streets of Paris buzzed with unrest. Whispers of war drifted through taverns and marketplaces, carried on the breath of men who had seen too much hunger and too little justice. Factional brawls between the Armagnacs and Burgundians were becoming bloodier, and the kingdom teetered toward chaos. For Isabella, the message was clear. The safety of her child, and any future children, depended not on walls or guards, but on her ability to navigate and, if possible, master this treacherous game. That night, as snow settled silently on the rooftops of Paris, she sat by the cradle and watched her daughter sleep. Her hand rested lightly on the swaddled bundle, and in that stillness she made a promise to this child, and to herself, that she would not be a pawn again. She would learn, she would endure, and when the time came, she would strike. France, in the early 15th century, was not a kingdom, so much as a patchwork quilt fraying at the seams. The madness of King Charles VI, his sudden bouts of delusion, his refusal at times to even recognize his own wife, had left the throne as fragile as porcelain. In his absence, two great factions clawed for control: the Armagnacs, led by Louis of Orleans and his allies, and the Burgundians, led by the formidable and calculating John the Fearless. The streets of Paris reflected this division like a fever. Chart. 1 week, banners of Burgundy hung over the city gates. The next, Armagnac soldiers swaggered through the markets. Merchants learned to speak carefully, tailoring their loyalties to whoever controlled the streets that day. For ordinary Parisians, this was no game of royal intrigue, it was survival. Prices soared, bread grew scarce, and riots could spark. From something as small as a rumor, Isabella and Charles lived in the eye of this storm. The Duke's lineage tied him to both factions by blood, which was less a blessing than a dangerous tightrope. Every choice whom to dine with, whom to lend coin to, which noble's child to sponsor, was a potential spark in a tinderbox. And though Charles preferred poetry and the arts over swords and battlefields, he was no fool. He knew the war of whispers could be just as deadly as the clash of steel. For Isabella, the chaos was a strange kind of education. She had been born into royalty, but in England the political lines had been cleaner, at least outwardly. Here nothing was fixed. Alliances shifted like river currents. Today's ally could be tomorrow's assassin. She learned to read not just words, but pauses, hesitations, the flicker of an eye toward a door. Yet for all its dangers, this fractured kingdom offered opportunity. A realm distracted by internal strife was one where a clever woman could move more freely. She knew when to speak and when to disappear into the background. And Isabella was learning quickly. The city itself seemed to mirror her own transformation. Once, Paris had been the jewel of Christendom, its cathedral towers lifting prayers heavenward, its scholars filling the halls of the Sorbonne with debate. Now it was restless, unpredictable, both dangerous and alive. The Seine carried not just goods but gossip. The taverns brewed not just ale but rebellion. In every corner there was a sense that something was about to break. And somewhere in the midst of it all, Isabella began to sense that her life, her survival, would be bound not just to Charles, but to the fate of this fractured, fevered kingdom. Whatever happened next, it would not be quiet. It was a bitter November night in Paris, the kind where the cold seemed to sharpen every sound. Somewhere beyond the palace, the bells of St. Paul told the hour. In the flickering glow of torchlight, a small entourage wound its way through the Rue Viel du Temple. At its center rode Louis of Orleans, brother to the king, uncle to Charles of Orleans, and one of the most powerful men in France. He had dined that evening with Queen Isabeau, his sister-in-law, discussing matters that could shift the balance of the kingdom. As he rode home, the streets were unusually quiet, save for the echo of hooves on cobblestones, then dash movement. A group of armed men emerged from the shadows. There was no challenge, no shouted accusation, just a sudden, brutal rush. The attackers dragged Louis from his horse, their swords flashing in the torchlight. Blades struck again and again, the cobbles running slick beneath him. By the time they were gone, his body was little more than a mangled shadow in the gutter. News spread like fire through dry timber. By dawn, Paris was a city in shock. The Duke of Orleans, dead cut down in the very heart of the capital. Whispers named John, the Fearless, as the mastermind, his motive. Remove a rival for power, and perhaps prevent Louis from influencing the king further. John did not deny it. In fact, he all but celebrated it, claiming the murder was a righteous act to save France from tyranny. For Charles, the loss was personal and political. His father was dead, murdered not in battle, but like a common criminal in the street. Grief twisted into something harder, the knowledge that his family's feud with Burgundy was now carved in blood. There could be no pretense of peace. Isabella felt the shockwave too. She had been growing accustomed to the court's dangers, but this was different. This was not a duel on a battlefield or a noble's fall from grace. It was assassination in cold blood. It told her, more clearly than any lesson, that in France's civil war, nothing was sacred. Not blood, not law, not even the streets of Paris. In the days that followed, the city bristled with soldiers, their armor clattering as they marched. In patrols, the taverns seethed with rumor, the markets buzzed with fear. The Armagnacs swore vengeance, and the Burgundians braced for retaliation. From that moment on, Isabella knew the ground beneath her feet had shifted. This was no longer the dance of courtly alliances. This was open war, one that would tear France apart and sweep everyone, willing or not, into its path. The months after Louis's murder were like living beneath a sky that never stopped rumbling. The air in Paris itself felt heavier with suspicion, the smell of smoke from burned-out workshops, and the metallic temps of fear. Isabella and Charles could not walk the palace corridors without passing clusters of murmuring courtiers, each weighing their loyalties with the caution of gamblers betting with their lives. Their marriage, still young, was now caught in the undertow of a civil war neither had chosen. Charles, barely 20, was thrust into the role of head of the Orleans branch. Overnight, he was expected to avenge his father's death, rally allies, and defend family lands, all while Burgundian spies slithered through the court like shadows. For Isabella, this was an education in how quickly personal bonds could be tested by politics. At dinners, she watched Charles's eyes dart not toward her, but toward the subtle exchanges between dukes, the slight pause in a servant's step, the coded language of a smile that meant danger. He was still gentle with her in private, but the weight on his shoulders was visible in the stoop of his back, the sudden silences that fell between them. Yet even in these strained days, they tried to protect a small sanctuary of normalcy. Isabella would join him in the library, where scrolls and illuminated manuscripts littered the tables, and they'd read poetry aloud, sometimes his own verses, sometimes the works of Villon or Christine de Pizan. It was a fragile refuge, but it reminded them both that there was more to life than the cold arithmetic of power. Still, the world outside did not wait. In the streets, fights broke out between Armagnac and Burgundian supporters. Trade faltered as merchants feared ambushes on the roads. Armored riders came and went from the palace gates at all hours, bearing letters sealed with urgent wax. Each new messenger seemed to carry worse new skirmishes in the countryside, cities switching allegiance, rumors of betrayal within their own circle. There were whispers that John the Fearless might attempt another strike this time, not at Charles, but at the women who tied the Orleans line together. Isabella could not ignore the way her ladies-in-waiting jumped at unexpected noises, or the way guards now trailed her even into the gardens. She was no longer simply a duchess. She had become a symbol, and symbols, in this game, were often targeted. Before armies ever clashed, through it all, the bond between her and Charles did not break, but it began to change. They were no longer simply partners in marriage. They were comrades in survival. And somewhere deep inside, Isabella began to understand that her own role in this war might one day require more than loyalty. It might require cunning. By the spring of 1411, Paris was no longer a city at peace, but a fortress bracing for the blow. Stone walls that had once been the proud frame of a thriving capital now loomed like clenched fists against the sky. Gates that welcomed merchants and pilgrims were reinforced with iron, and every archway seemed to bristle with watchmen. The Seine, usually dotted with barges carrying goods, now ran quieter, the ripples broken only by the slow passage of military boats ferrying weapons and men. The Armagnacs had moved to challenge Burgundian dominance, and Paris, restless, crowded, unpredictable, became the stage for a slow strangulation. Supplies thinned, bread grew scarce, and the price of a simple loaf could buy you a whole chicken in better times. The poor gnawed on crusts of blackened rye, while the wealthy hoarded barrels of wine and salted meat in their cellars, watching the city's mood sour like spoiled fruit. For Isabella, the palace had turned into a gilded cage. The windows offered views of rooftops and riverbanks, but beyond them lay a world she could not touch without an escort of armed men. The gardens she once wandered were now patrolled, the laughter of her ladies-in-waiting replaced by murmurs about troop movements and rumors of infiltration. Couriers brought letters, sealed with the Orleans crest, their contents often so grim that Charles read them in silence, his lips pressed into a thin line. Outside the palace walls, tension crackled in the air like the pause before a summer storm. The Burgundian militia patrolled the streets, their boots striking the cobbles in a rhythm that made shopkeepers close early and mothers hurry their children inside. Walls bloomed with graffiti denouncing the Orleans cause, some crude, some surprisingly poetic in their venom. And all the while, both factions prepared for the possibility that words and intimidation would no longer suffice, that steel would soon decide what ink could not. When the fighting came, it was sudden and savage. Skirmishes erupted in narrow alleys, where cobblestones ran slick with rain and blood. Isabella could hear the faint clang of steel from her chambers at night, mingled with the low roar of voices, part battle cries, part the panicked shouts of civilians caught in the crossfire. Fires broke out in market squares, sending columns of smoke curling above the rooftops. a grim signal visible even from the palace windows. Charles, determined to rally the Armagnac cause, often left for days at a time. Each departure was a quiet agony for Isabella, who knew that in this war, a ride beyond the gates could as easily end in glory as in an unmarked grave. She occupied her hours in prayer, embroidery, and composing letters. She sometimes never sent letters that spoke of longing, fear, and the small details of her days that she hoped would tether him back to her. The siege of Paris was not yet total, but it was enough to make the city feel smaller, tighter, as though every breath had to be taken in measured sips. And in that compressed space, alliances hardened, resentments deepened, and the game of survival became more dangerous than ever. Even within the thick stone walls of the palace, the air felt poisoned not by smoke or dust, but by something subtler and far more corrosive: distrust. Servants who once exchanged gossip freely now spoke in half-sentences, glancing over their shoulders before finishing a thought. Courtiers bowed with flawless grace, yet their eyes flickered with calculation, as if measuring what might be gained or lost by every word they spoke in Isabella's presence. The Burgundian faction, though holding power in Paris, could not claim the loyalty of every heart inside the court. Some of Isabella's ladies were rumored to have kin among the Armagnacs. Others had lovers in the militia. A misplaced glance, a letter left half hidden beneath a cushion, even a blush at the wrong name, any of these could be a thread that, once pulled, might unravel someone's life. Isabella had learned to watch faces as closely as she once watched the turning of the seasons, noting who avoided whose company, who left the room too quickly when certain topics arose. There was one incident that etched itself into her memory. During an evening gathering in the Queen's apartments, a harpist played softly while ladies embroidered by the fire. A courtier, thin, pale, with a smile that never reached his eyes, mentioned, almost casually, that he had heard news from Orleans. The room stilled, the harp's melody faltering for half a beat. He spoke of troop movements, of a shipment of arms intercepted on the road. It was framed as idle chatter, but Isabella felt the weight of every gaze shifting toward her, searching for a reaction. She gave them none, merely nodding and returning her eyes to her work. Though her heart beat like a drum, it was not only outsiders she had to guard against. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, had her own shifting alliances, her loyalties, as changeable as the spring wind. One day she appeared to favor Burgundian policy, the next she lent her ear to an Armagnac envoy. Isabella could never be sure whether a kind word from the Queen was a genuine gesture or a careful ploy to draw out some confession. Even the palace corridors seemed to conspire in the unease. Their echoes swallowed footsteps in a way that made it impossible to tell if someone followed you. A conversation could drift through a half-open door like smoke, carrying fragments. Traitor, gift from Burgundy, the dauphin that left more questions than answers. And always, beneath it all, was the knowledge that one wrong word could find its way to the wrong ears, and from there to the dungeons. Or worse. In such an atmosphere, Isabella found herself withdrawing more and more into the sanctuary of her private chambers. She began keeping a diary, written in a cipher only she understood. It became her only safe place to pour out the tangled skein of her fears, her longing for Charles, and her uncertainty about who, if anyone, could be trusted. The entries grew darker as the weeks passed, recording small betrayals, subtle threats, and the creeping sense that the palace was less a home than a gilded web, beautiful, but designed to ensnare. And outside, the war pressed closer. The whispers of the court soon to be drowned out by the cries of the streets. The first frost came early that year, biting into the city like a predator that would not release its prey. At first, Parisians greeted it with the stoic acceptance that comes from long familiarity with harsh winters. But by December, the frost had deepened into a killing cold, the Seine's surface hardening into slabs of ice thick enough to bear the weight of scavenging dogs. Smoke from 1,000 hearths rose into the pale sky, but inside many homes the fires burned low, for wood had grown scarce and dear. Isabella could feel the change in the air, not just in temperature, but in mood. The bustling markets that once overflowed with produce and chatter now displayed only wilted roots and hard dark loaves. The prices were absurd, twice what they had been in the autumn. Those who had coin bought what they could, while the poor stood shivering at the edge of the square, hoping for charity. Sometimes she heard the muffled wail of a child whose hunger had gone past tears into something quieter and far more terrible. Inside the palace, the Burgundian faction maintained its feasts, though even their tables showed signs of strain. Gone were the fragrant oranges from the south and the sweet Malmsey wine from abroad. Instead, the courses leaned heavily on salted meats and preserved fruits. Yet these diminished banquets still shone with gold plate and embroidered cloths, a stark contrast to the streets where bread riots broke out in the shadow of Notre Dame. One morning, on her way back from the chapel, Isabella witnessed a scene that stayed with her long after. Through the half-open postern gate of the palace, she saw a woman in rags, kneeling in the snow, her hands cupped around a scrap of bread. A boy of perhaps 6 crouched beside her, wolfing it down in desperate bites. Before she could call out to offer help, a guard drove them away with the butt of his spear, their figures vanishing into the white haze. Isabella stood rooted. The prayer she had whispered moments earlier, "Give us this day our daily bread," sounding suddenly hollow. The winter was not only cruel to the poor. Disease found fertile ground in bodies weakened by hunger. Fevers spread through the crowded quarters, and even the palace was not immune. Servants took ill. One of Isabella's ladies collapsed in her chamber, her skin hot as embers. Physicians spoke in low tones of ague and winter flux, their treatments a mixture of superstition and desperation. At night, the city's silence was deceptive. Beneath the frozen stillness lay tension like a drawn bowstring. Isabella could sense that hunger was not merely an absence of food, it was an accelerant, ready to ignite old grudges into violence. The factions within Paris, already divided by loyalty to Burgundy or Armagnac, now found themselves competing for survival itself. Rumors swirled that Armagnac agents were hoarding grain, that Burgundians were seizing supplies meant for the poor. Whether true or not, each story fanned the flames of resentment. And through it all, Isabella's thoughts drifted to Charles. Was he warm? Was he fed? Or was he too, staring into the dark each night, listening to the wind howl around shuttered windows, feeling the same gnawing hunger that haunted her dreams? At first, Isabella tried to be patient. Couriers could be delayed by snowbound roads, by swollen rivers, by the whims of weather and war alike. But as the days folded into weeks, and the weeks into months, the absence of Charles's handwriting on her desk became a wound that would not close. Each morning she waited for the rustle of parchment and the faint scent of sealing wax that heralded the arrival of correspondence. The palace clerks came and went, delivering messages to the Burgundian lords, dispatches from the provinces, petitions from merchants, but never anything from the Dauphin. The absence grew heavier than any letter could have been. Once she intercepted a courier in the courtyard, his horse steaming in the winter air. She asked him outright whether he carried anything from Burgundy, and he shook his head, muttering that the roads to the south had grown dangerous. Bands of mercenaries, hungry and unpaid, now roamed the countryside, seizing goods and robbing travelers. In the chaos, perhaps a message had been lost. Perhaps. But there were other possibilities, darker ones. The Burgundian advisers were quick to fill the silence with their own narratives, that Charles was too occupied with his court to write, that his cause was failing, that his allies had deserted him. Each insinuation was a calculated needle, meant to pierce her loyalty and push her toward acceptance of Burgundy's control. She smiled politely when they spoke, but inside, her resolve tightened like a clenched fist. In her private chamber, she kept the last letter he had sent her, months earlier. She read it until the ink seemed to blur into the parchment. His words had been careful, too careful, she realized now, as if written with someone looking over his shoulder. "We must endure, ma mie," he had written. "All storms break." In time, she had clung to those words, but storms that last too long can hollow out the strongest of timbers. Then came whispers from the servants' corridors, of intercepted messages, of letters turned over to Burgundian hands before they ever reached her. One night, when the palace had gone quiet, she walked to the scribe's hall under pretense of retrieving a devotional text. By candlelight, she saw a stack of unopened letters piled in a locked chest. A guard, posted at the door, shifted uneasily. Under her gaze, she asked no questions, none. He would answer, but the image burned in her mind. The absence of a letter became a presence in itself, a constant companion at her side. She found herself glancing toward the gate whenever hoofbeats echoed in the courtyard, searching the faces of arriving riders, as if she might recognize the one who would finally bring her news. But no such rider came. Outside, the thaw had begun, and with it the streets turned to mud, releasing the stench of rot that winter had hidden. But inside Isabella's heart, the ice only deepened. She began to understand that this was not mere neglect or misfortune, it was a strategy. A siege laid not upon walls, but upon her faith. The Burgundian court prided itself on appearances, velvet draperies, measured voices, and a veneer of civility so polished it could blind the untrained eye. Banquets were held as if nothing in France was tearing itself apart, long tables heavy with roasted game, candied fruit, and goblets of Burgundy's richest wine. Courtiers laughed at carefully chosen jokes, musicians plucked gentle airs, and the herald's voice rang out with titles and honors as if they still meant what they once had. But Isabella knew these gatherings for what they were: theater. Every smile was rehearsed, every toast calculated, every shared glance across the table a quiet negotiation. The Duke's ministers moved through the hall like actors reading from a script only they could see, their words dripping with pleasantries but weighted with unspoken threats. Once, during a feast in early spring, a visiting envoy from Flanders stood and praised the peace that Burgundy had brought to its domains. The word hung in the air like incense, sweet at first, but cloying on the tongue. Isabella almost laughed at the irony. This peace was nothing more than a pause between acts of violence, a stillness maintained by fear, not by harmony. She played her part well. Her gown shimmered with embroidered gold. Her posture was impeccable, her smile gracious yet unreadable. But under the table, her hands curled into fists against the silk of her skirts. When the Duke's eyes met hers, he found only the polite acknowledgment expected of a noblewoman. She gave him nothing else. No slip, no flash of resentment, though. The strain of holding the mask in place left her sleepless at night. Behind the scenes, the machinery of power churned on. Burgundian envoys traveled to England, returning with crates of fine cloth and more troubling cargo, letters bearing the seals of English commanders. There was talk of new alliances, of trade agreements that favored Burgundy's coffers, at the expense of the Dauphin's. Dwindling resources. The court celebrated these developments with banquets and tournaments, as though economic betrayal were a cause for merriment. Even the entertainments served as subtle propaganda. Minstrels sang ballads, glorifying Burgundian victories. Poets recited verses likening the Duke to Solomon in his wisdom. The stories of Charles and his loyalists were conspicuously absent, their deeds erased in favor of a narrative that suited the victors. Isabella noted each omission, each quiet rewriting of history, and stored it away. Yet the mask of peace was not perfect. There were cracks. Once, in a shadowed corner of the great hall, she overheard two guards muttering about a skirmish on the border, small, bloody, and officially unacknowledged. Another time, she saw a messenger's hands trembling as he presented a sealed letter to the Duke, his eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away. The air beneath the silken canopy of the court was thick with things unsaid. Isabella understood that survival here meant playing a role to perfection, but she also knew that every performance eventually ends. The question was not whether the mask would slip, it was who would be ready to act. When it did, the true life of the Burgundian court did not happen in the glittering halls or beneath the painted ceilings. It pulsed in the narrow corridors, behind half-closed doors, in the drafty stairwells where torchlight wavered and words dropped to a whisper. Here, away from the eyes of the Duke's heralds, alliances were forged in murmurs, and treachery slipped like a shadow along the walls. Isabella learned to walk these spaces with care. In the public chambers, she was the Duke's courteous guest. In the back passages, she became something else, an observer, a listener, a woman who knew that information was worth more than gold. Her steps were light, her ears sharper than any courtier's dagger. It was in one of these dim corridors that she first overheard the conversation that would alter her understanding of her captivity. To Menwan, a Burgundian secretary, she recognized. The other, a stranger whose voice was low and urgent, spoke of an agreement with the English. Not a mere trade pact, but something deeper, more binding. A mutual pledge to maintain the Dauphin's isolation. The words permanent settlement were used, and Isabella's stomach clenched as if she had swallowed ice. That night, she could not sleep. She thought of the Dauphin in his tenuous exile, of the way the Burgundian court smiled while tightening the noose. The candle on her desk burned down to a stump as she considered what this meant. Her situation was not temporary. She was not a guest in waiting for her freedom. She was a pawn in a game designed to end with her absence from the board. Still, she did not panic. She began to map the court in her mind, not just the rooms and corridors, but the patterns of movement, who met with whom, which servants could be trusted to carry a message without reading it, which doors were left unlocked when they should not have been. She learned the rhythm of the guards' patrols and the moments when the kitchens emptied just before the evening feast. Occasionally, in the quieter moments, she encountered other figures in these in-between spaces, people whose smiles did not match their eyes, who stepped aside too quickly or bowed too deeply. Some were merely cautious. Others were watching her, just as she was watching them. One evening, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the shadows, a clerk who had once served in the Dauphin's household, now in Burgundian livery. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant there was an unspoken exchange, recognition, caution, and perhaps a flicker of shared purpose. He looked away before she could speak, but the seed of possibility was planted. The corridors were dangerous. More than once, she doubled back on her steps after hearing soft footfalls behind her, only to find the hallway empty. Doors that had been ajar in the morning were shut tight by evening, and yet she knew that if there was any hope of regaining control over her fate, it would be found in these shadowed spaces. Not at the Duke's gleaming table. In the court's grand chambers, the Duke's word was law. In the corridors, law was replaced by something older and far more volatile, the silent understanding that power belonged to whoever could see in the dark. Isabella's next step was to turn what she knew into something that could travel beyond these walls. A thought alone was useless. It needed to take form, to be carried in ink and paper. But in the Burgundian court, letters were more dangerous than daggers. Every message risked being intercepted, read, and used against her. She began by studying the way correspondence moved through the castle. The Duke's seal-bearer kept his keys in a leather pouch at his waist, but the lesser clerks, those tasked with carrying mundane orders, were less careful. She noticed one clerk, a young man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, who often tucked letters into his sleeve while fetching wine or bread from the kitchens. His habit was not born of deceit, but laziness, and Isabella marked him as someone whose path might cross with hers. The difficulty was not writing the message, but ensuring its meaning could be hidden in plain sight. She thought of the courtly verses she had read in her youth, with their veiled references and private symbols. A poem could say one thing and mean another entirely. If a guard read it, they would see nothing more than idle words from a lonely princess. But in the right hand's hands that knew the code eye could carry warnings, names, and instructions. She practiced at night, composing verses by candlelight, her quill moving slowly so as not to blot the paper. Each word had to serve two masters: the casual reader, who would see nothing, and the intended recipient, who would see everything. One cold morning, she tested her method. She gave the clerk a folded sheet, asking him to deliver it to a lady-in-waiting in another wing of the castle. The woman was an acquaintance, not a friend, but Isabella suspected she had ties to the Dauphin's sympathizers. Hours later, the woman returned the note, smiling faintly and saying only, "Your words are lovely, my lady." That smile told Isabella all she needed to know. The code had been read and understood, but success brought danger. Twice in the following week, her rooms were entered in her absence. Once her trunk was left open. Another time the papers on her desk were disturbed. She began locking her writing materials in a small chest, hiding the key inside the hollow of a wooden candlestick. Even so, She never kept more than a single sheet of writing at a time. Anything else, she burned. The act of burning became almost ceremonial, watching the flames curl around the ink, erasing her secrets before they could be stolen. The ashes she scattered into the fireplace, their fragments drifting upward like gray snow. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. Letters could pass warnings, but they could not change her position outright. For that, she would need more than ink. She would need allies. And to find them, she would have to risk opening doors that had remained locked for a reason. Outside her window, the winter deepened. The air grew sharp, and frost crept along the glass. Somewhere in the frozen stillness, the first threads of a larger plan were beginning to weave themselves together. The invitation arrived on a strip of cream parchment, heavy with the scent of rosewater. It announced the Feast of Masks, a midwinter tradition where rank and identity dissolved beneath silks, feathers, and painted visages. For one night, the rigid order of the Burgundian court would loosen, and strangers could speak without fear of being overheard or recognized. To most, it was an evening of indulgence, wine, music, and intrigue. To Isabella, it was a rare gift, a cloak for her intentions. Beneath a mask, she could seek out whispers, measure loyalties, and perhaps plant seeds for the alliances she needed. The great hall was transformed. Garlands of evergreen hung from the rafters, glistening with frost and gold thread. Hundreds of candles burned in mirrored sconces, doubling the light until the walls seemed to shimmer. Musicians played lutes and shawms, their melodies twining through the air like smoke. Guests drifted through the room, their identities obscured by elaborate masks, some grotesque, some beautiful, all hiding more than they revealed. Isabella's own mask was a delicate thing, white lacquer edged with silver filigree. It covered her eyes and nose, leaving her mouth free to speak or to smile without revealing what lay behind it. Her gown was deep blue velvet, the shade of a night sky just before the first stars appear. She knew that while others flaunted their wealth, her quiet elegance would draw the right kind of attention, those who noticed subtleties, not just spectacle. Moving through the crowd was like drifting through a dream. A masked man dressed as a falcon bowed low and murmured, "Some birds cannot be caged." Another, wearing the face of a Roman senator, offered her a goblet of spiced wine and whispered that not all within these walls were loyal to the Duke. Every exchange felt like a game played on the edge of a blade. The most dangerous moment came when she found herself cornered near a tapestry by a figure in a gilded lion mask. His voice was smooth, practiced, the sort that could belong to a courtier or a spy. He spoke of her late father with unsettling familiarity, and when he mentioned the Dauphin's cause, his gaze held hers for a fraction too long. Whether he sought to recruit her or entrap her remained unclear. She responded with a half-smile and a meaningless remark about the music, then slipped away into the swirl of dancers before he could press further. Yet the night was not without gain. Between dances and feigned laughter, she learned that certain shipments ostensibly of wine were being routed through towns loyal to France. She also discovered that one of the Duke's senior advisors would soon travel to Bruges, creating a brief gap in his control over court correspondence. That, she knew, could be a window worth exploiting when the revelry finally ended. Isabella stepped into the cold courtyard, her breath misting in the moonlight. Snow had begun to fall, catching in the folds of her cloak. She removed her mask and felt the night air against her bare skin, sharp and cleansing. The Feast of Masks had confirmed what she already suspected. The court was a nest of shifting loyalties, its alliances as fragile as spun glass, and in that fragility lay opportunity. She dared to take it. The man did not look like someone who could tip the scales of a duchy. His cloak was plain wool, the hem frayed from years of travel. His boots bore the dust of many roads, and his hands large, square, and scarred spoke of work, not courtly life. Yet when he introduced himself as Peter van Elst, a wine merchant of Ghent, Isabella felt the subtle prickle of instinct. This was no ordinary trader. They met in the quiet back room of a candlemaker's shop, the air thick with the scent of tallow and beeswax. Peter spoke plainly, without the gilded phrases of courtiers. He had ships, he said, and men loyal to him. His cargo moved not only wine but letters, documents, and, when necessary, secrets. He knew which harbors could be trusted, which customs officials could be bribed, and which ports belonged to men whose allegiance could change with the wind. "I've served the Duke when it suited me," he admitted, his eyes narrowing in the flickering candlelight, "and I've served his enemies when the coin was better. But I am a merchant first, my lady. My loyalty is bought in silver, and my silence in gold." Isabella did not flinch at the bluntness. She recognized it for what it was, a test. "Then perhaps," she replied, "you and I can both profit from a certain discretion." The bargain they struck that night was simple in words, complex in risk. Peter would carry her letters, hidden among his cargo, to allies beyond Burgundy's borders. In return, she would ensure that certain lucrative contracts rights to supply the court with wine fell into his hands. It was a partnership stitched together by mutual need and the unspoken understanding that betrayal would destroy them both before they parted. Peter gave her something unexpected, a small wooden token, carved with the image of a coiled serpent. "Show this to any of my captains," he said. "They'll know you speak with my authority. But guard it well, for it is worth more than any seal." That night, as she hid the token beneath the false bottom of her traveling chest, Isabella felt the first flicker of momentum. The court was a place of whispers and veiled glances, but beyond its walls, there were men and women who could move unseen, carry her words where they needed to go, and return with news that could shift the balance of power in the grand halls. Of Burgundy, a merchant might seem a minor piece on the board. But in the game Isabella was beginning to play, such pieces could prove decisive when they knew how to slip between shadows. The merchant's promise was more than a trade agreement. It was the first true thread in the web she intended to weave, and Peter, for all his talk of profit, had the wary eyes of a man who had seen enough to know the cost of trust. Bruges was a city that pretended to sleep. By day, its canals shimmered in the northern light, carrying barges laden with wool, spices, and casks of wine. Merchants shouted prices in a half-dozen tongues, and the square before the belfry rang with the clang of blacksmiths and the calls of fishmongers. But when the sun dipped, the bustle gave way to something quieter, something watchful. It was here, under the cover of a fog-thick evening, that Isabella made her first move. Peter's token was warm in her palm as she stepped into the cramped tavern tucked behind St. John's Hospital. The smell of damp wood and sour ale filled the air, masking the low hum of voices in the back room. A single glance from the innkeeper was enough. Her presence had been expected. A man rose from the shadows, broad-shouldered, his beard flecked with gray. He introduced himself only as Captain Roland, master of the St. Clair, a ship bound for Lubeck with a cargo of wine and now a far more delicate freight. Isabella handed him a sealed parchment, its wax impressed not with her own crest, but with the mark of a minor trade house, an extra layer of concealment. The letter itself was written in 2 hands. The visible message, a routine request for wool shipments, was harmless enough. The hidden one, worked in a cipher of alternating ink shades only visible under lamplight, carried instructions to an ally in the Hanseatic League. It asked for information on troop movements along Burgundy's northern frontier and hinted at a willingness to fund certain delays in their supply lines. As Roland slipped the letter into his coat, he glanced at her with the knowing look of a man accustomed to dangerous errands. "Storms don't just come from the sea, my lady," he murmured. "Best you keep your decks clear." Outside, the fog clung to the cobbles, swallowing sound. Isabella walked back toward the square. Passing women huddled in doorways, and apprentices carrying baskets of bread from the night ovens. No one paid her much, mend a lady. Traveling with only a maid was hardly worth noting, in a city that saw nobles and traders pass daily. Yet she felt the change in the air. Her words, once confined to the echoing halls of the ducal court, were now in motion, slipping down the Zin Canal, out into the North Sea, and beyond Burgundy's reach. Somewhere in Lubeck, a man would break the wax, read the hidden lines, and understand that a new player had entered the game by the time she returned to her lodging. The bells of the belfry were tolling the late hour. She sat by the window, watching the canal water ripple in the lamplight. Bruges might seem still, but beneath its surface, messages were moving, hands were shaking on shadowed bargains, and coins were changing owners in the name of causes. No one dared speak aloud. For the first time, Isabella felt the pulse of her own network, forming not yet a web, but a thread stretching across borders. And she knew that once a thread was pulled, it could unravel far more than anyone expected. In the great hall of the ducal palace at Dijon, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and pine resin. Torches hissed as they burned, casting restless shadows on the painted shields of Burgundy's vassals. Charles the Bold sat at the head of the long oaken table, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the maps spread before him like a man reading the future. But his future lay not in Bruges, nor even in the Low Countries. The Duke's attention had shifted eastward, toward the turbulent frontiers of the Holy Roman Empire. The Swiss Confederacy, those stubborn mountain folk who refused to bow to any crown, had grown bolder, harassing trade routes and undermining his allies. War was inevitable, and Charles intended to strike before winter made the Alpine passes impassable. It was, for Isabella, a blessing wrapped in steel. With the Duke's focus locked on Switzerland, the scrutiny over domestic matters loosened. Courtiers whispered of troop levies and new mercenary contracts. The wine at banquets flowed more freely, as though everyone were eager to forget the tension gathering on the horizon. The absence of the Duke's gaze gave her room to breathe and act. She used the time with precision. Letters that might once have taken weeks to pass through the court now slipped unnoticed into merchant convoys bound for the Baltic. Spies loyal to her many recruited from among overlooked clerks, debt-ridden squires, and the wives of absent soldiers carried bits of intelligence like seeds in their pockets. They passed through Antwerp, Ghent, and Cologne, each adding to a growing picture of Burgundy's vulnerabilities. Still, the Duke's absence did not mean safety. His ministers remained watchful, each with their own ambitions. The Chancellor, Guillaume Huguenet, had begun to notice the unusual number of riders visiting the properties associated with Isabella's dowry. One evening, at a banquet heavy with roasted capon and spiced pears, he approached her with a smile too warm to be sincere. "It must be difficult," he said, "keeping the household in order when His Grace is so far afield." Her answering laugh was light, almost careless. "Oh, I am no soldier, Chancellor. I concern myself with kitchens and accounts matters far too dull for a man of your talents." Yet under the table, her hand tightened around the stem of her goblet, while Charles negotiated troop movements in distant halls. Isabella negotiated something quieter: trust. She knew that the Duke's war would consume coin faster than it consumed. men, and the merchants of Bruges and Ghent were already grumbling about new levies. Every grumble was a seed, and she had learned that in politics. Discontent was the richest soil of all. By late autumn, the leaves along the Dijonais roads had turned the color of old gold. Couriers rode out daily toward the east, carrying the Duke's commands to captains and allies. Few noticed the other messengers, those traveling north and west, whose instructions were far less official, but perhaps no less dangerous. For Isabella, the war in Switzerland was more than a distant campaign. It was a veil, and behind it she was weaving her own designs, stitch by careful stitch. And if the Duke returned victorious, she intended to meet him not as a sidelined consort, but as a figure whose influence reached well beyond the walls of Dijon. The cloth hall of Bruges was never truly silent, even in the gray months of winter. When frost glazed the cobblestones and the canals steamed faintly in the morning air, the place thrummed with 1,000 quiet dealings. Weavers with roughened hands bargained over bolts of Flemish broadcloth. Lombard moneylenders draped in fur-lined cloaks leaned close to discuss bills of exchange. Apprentices darted between stalls, carrying scraps of fabric and murmured orders. Here, amid the smell of wool grease and the sharp tang of dye-vats, Isabella found one of her most potent tools, not in the form of a soldier or a nobleman, but in the whispering networks of the merchant guilds. Unlike courtiers, merchants were not dazzled by titles alone. They weighed alliances in scales of profit and loss. And in Burgundy, where the cloth trade was the artery of wealth, a well-placed whisper could shift the flow of coin as effectively as any law. Her visits were always discreet. Officially, she came to inspect shipments connected to her dowry estates, or to discuss tariffs on imported silk. In truth, she came to listen. Sitting at the edge of a counting table, she let the talk wash over her. Complaints about Duke Charles's new levies for the Swiss campaign. Fears that war would disrupt trade with Milan and Venice. Murmurs that some towns might petition for exemptions. Every fragment mattered. A single merchant's frustration in Bruges could be mirrored in the grumbling of a guild in Ghent. And if enough such voices harmonized, they could become a chorus the Duke could not ignore. Isabella understood this, and she began weaving these voices together into something like a political fabric, stronger than any bolt of wool. To strengthen her position, she extended quiet favors. A delayed tax collection here, a discreet introduction to a court notary there. She arranged for one widow of a prominent dyer to secure a coveted guild license, something the Duke's ministers had overlooked. Each gesture was noted, and the debt, though unspoken, was felt. In the dim light of the cloth hall's vaulted chambers, Isabella became a rumor herself. Some said she was simply looking out for the prosperity of Burgundy. Others whispered that she had ambitions beyond her husband's shadow. The most cynical merchants claimed she was building a web, and that every concession she gave was another silken thread binding them to her. One afternoon, as snow swirled in from the North Sea, she met with Peter van der Elst, a master weaver, whose loom supplied half the city. He leaned across the table, the knuckles of his hands pale against the wood. "The Duke takes our gold to fight the Swiss," he said, "but it is we who will feel the cold if the roads close and the wool stops coming." Isabella's gaze was calm, her voice even. "Then perhaps, Master Peter, we must ensure that our voices reach the Duke before his wars empty the coffers. A well-timed word can travel faster than an army." By the time she left Bruges, the frost on the bridges had thickened to ice. Yet, in the cloth hall, something had shifted. Her quiet suggestions had found root among men who measured risk and coin, and reward and influence. And though the Duke still commanded his soldiers far away in the mountains, Isabella was assembling her own kind of army, one made of whispers, promises, and debts. News from the Swiss front came not as a trumpet blast, but as a slow, uneven trickle letters, carried by shivering messengers, rumors smuggled in with spice carts, tavern talk swollen with invention. In the early months, the tidings were bold. The Duke's banners had advanced through snow-choked passes. Villages had been taken without resistance. The Swiss, it was whispered, were scattering before Burgundy's might. But Burgundy's merchants were not fools. They had seen wars before, and knew that victories too loudly proclaimed often hid a bill yet to be paid. As the winter deepened, the accounts arriving in Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp told another story, one of caravans delayed, wool shipments rotting in damp warehouses, and Italian bankers tightening their credit. In the shadow of each reported triumph lay the question, at what cost? Isabella read every dispatch with the patience of a scribe and the cold precision of a chess player. The Swiss were tenacious, their militia drawn from mountain villages where men fought not for glory but for survival. Burgundy's soldiers were better armed, better trained, but they were also far from home, and each mile of frozen road stretched the Duke's supply lines thinner. Isabella could almost feel the strain, like a seam pulled taut in a velvet gown. One wrong movement and the whole fabric could tear. For the Duke, the campaign was a matter of honor and unshakable belief that Burgundy's prestige demanded nothing less than the subjugation of these stubborn mountain republics. For Isabella, it was a calculation. Every coin spent in the Alps was a coin not spent on Burgundy's markets, on its artisans, or on the civic festivals that kept towns loyal. Each absence of the Duke left her both more exposed and more free. To act, she began to sense an opening. If the war dragged on, she could position herself as the voice of reason in a court intoxicated by dreams of conquest. To do so, she needed allies whose influence reached beyond courtly gossip, men and women who could sway guild leaders, city councils, and perhaps even foreign envoys. Her quiet work in the cloth hall had laid the foundation. Now, the Duke's obsession with the Swiss might give her the chance to build higher. Yet opportunity was a dangerous thing. The more she stepped into the space left by her husband, the more she risked drawing his suspicion when he returned. And Charles, for all his devotion to her, was a man who brooked no rival in matters of authority. She knew that if she miscalculated, her hand was seen to overreach. Her influence could vanish like frost in the morning sun. On a raw February evening, a courier arrived from the front, his cloak stiff with ice. The letter he carried was brief. Victory had been won at a place called Grandson, but the Duke's losses were heavy. Isabella read the words twice, feeling the weight of what was left unsaid. Victory, yes, but a victory bought with blood, coin, and time that Burgundy could ill afford. That night, as the lamps flickered in the draughty halls of Ghent, Isabella walked alone, her steps echoing on the flagstones. She thought not of the battle itself, but of the threads pulling tighter around her, the merchant's unease, the noble's grumbling, the Duke's absence, and the war's slow bleeding of the treasury. She was not yet ready to tug at those threads, but she knew sooner than anyone expected she would. The city of Ghent had always been a place of restless energies, markets bustling from dawn, its guilds fiercely guarding their privileges, its people proud to the point of obstinacy. Yet that winter, a different current seemed to run beneath the frozen canals and the smoke-choked rooftops. The air was thick, not with the chatter of trade, but with whispers, questions spoken to, softly to carry, yet sharp enough to cut, if overheard. Bread was dearer than it had been in years. The Duke's war had drained the countryside, pulling men from fields and mills, leaving women and children to shoulder the work. Caravans from the south arrived half empty, their drivers muttering of bandits and snowbound passes. In the taverns, along the Grassley, merchants spoke in careful tones of unpaid debts and contracts impossible to fulfill. And though none dared name it outright, more than a few wondered if Burgundy's reach had grown longer than its grasp. Isabella moved through the city like a figure from another world, wrapped in sable and velvet, her face composed, her words measured, but she saw more than she let on. She noticed the guild leaders who met in private rooms after sunset, the envoys from foreign courts who asked pointed questions about the Duke's absence, the way the city guard kept a sharper eye on gatherings in the market square. She also noticed the sermons. At first, they were no more than the usual firebrand talk preachers, railing against greed, urging charity in hard times. But slowly, a sharper edge emerged. Some spoke of rulers who neglected their people for glory, of kingdoms undone by pride. The metaphors were drawn from Scripture, but the message was clear enough for any man in Ghent to understand. The challenge for Isabella was to know how far to let such murmurs run before they became a threat. Quelling dissent too harshly might fan the flames. Ignoring it could allow it to spread beyond control. She had no illusions about the city's loyalty. It was not to her, nor to the Duke, but to its own freedoms, its own prosperity. One evening, in the dim glow of her private chamber, she received a visitor, an alderman of the Weavers' Guild, a man whose family had held influence in Ghent for generations. He spoke plainly, his voice low. "My lady, the people grow anxious. They see coin flowing to the war, and none returning. If the Duke does not soon return with peace, there will be unrest." Isabella listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. When he was done, she thanked him with the faintest of smiles, promising nothing. Yet inside, her thoughts were racing. The alderman was not a man to waste words. If he had come to her in person, it meant the city's patience was close to breaking. That night, she sat by her desk, long after the candles had burned low, drafting letters in her own hand, some to trusted allies in Bruges, others to contacts as far away as Paris. She did not yet know whether the Duke's war would end in triumph or disaster. But she knew this much: Ghent was a tinderbox, and if she could keep her hand steady, she might just decide when and how the spark would fall, when liberation finally came. It did not sweep in with the clarion call of trumpets or the grand unfurling of banners. It crept in almost shyly, like dawn after a long and sleepless night, first as rumors carried by exhausted messengers, then as official proclamations, sealed and signed, borne by riders too weary to sit tall in their saddles. For the people of Ghent, the news brought both jubilation and unease. The Duke's armies had returned victorious, or at least victorious enough to force favorable terms. The occupying forces had withdrawn, their banners lowered, their camps abandoned to the winter wind. Bells rang out across the city, echoing over the frozen waterways, and for the first time in months, laughter spilled into the streets without a trace of fear in it. But the victory had a cost. The men who came back were not the same as those who had left. Some bore scars that would never heal. Others carried a silence heavier than any wound. Mothers counted their blessings while counting the empty places at their tables. The war had ended, but the hunger, the debts, and the political cracks it had deepened remained. Isabella understood this better than most. She stood on the steps of the ducal palace, the winter sun pale against the stone, greeting returning commanders, clasping hands with those who had served her cause faithfully. Yet even in those moments of celebration, her eyes searched for signs, avoided her gaze, who whispered to whom, which guild leader stayed away entirely. The Duke, though triumphant, was slower to return. His final negotiations had kept him abroad, and Isabella's regency stretched into yet another uncertain month. The absence gave her a strange freedom. She could shape the narrative of victory before he arrived to claim it. She commissioned public feasts, ordered grain distributed to the poorest quarters, and quietly arranged for certain debts to be forgiven. The people needed to see her as their advocate, not merely the Duke's stand-in. Yet beneath the surface, there was a shifting in the political current. The same guilds that had once murmured in secret now met more openly, discussing not rebellion, but the terms of continued loyalty. The war had shown them that Burgundy's hold was not unshakably, and once that thought takes root, it is difficult to pull out entirely. On a cold evening not long after the last enemy troops had gone, Isabella walked the ramparts alone, her breath ghosting in the air. Below her, the city twinkled with lanterns, the sounds of revelry carrying faintly on the wind. Somewhere in those narrow streets, men were making plans, some for trade, some for power, some for the future of Ghent. Itself she knew the truth, that no celebration could hide. Liberation was only the beginning. Wars leave shadows, and in those shadows, ambitions grow. The Duke would return to a realm both freed and unsettled, its loyalties freshly tested. Whether Burgundy's future would be shaped by steel, by coin, or by quiet negotiation was a question no victory parade could answer. For now, Isabella turned from the city lights and walked back into the keep. The banners would stay up, the bells would keep ringing, and the people would drink to their freedom. But she was already looking beyond the celebrations, into the long and uncertain road ahead.